Well, as we're all aware, Russia, under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, has proven to be a surprisingly disruptive factor on the world scene. With an economy the size of Italy's, 1/10 that of China, and a population that until recently was actually shrinking, Russia has been punching well above its weight in exploiting weaknesses in the West and challenging the West's efforts to promote liberal values around the world. So, how has Putin and company managed to get away with annexing Crimea, promoting insurrection in eastern Ukraine, intervening in Syria, and least but not last, interfering with the US presidential election process? His success in playing a weak hand after the collapse of the Soviet Union has fascinated Kremlin watchers ever since he took the reins in 2000. Today, we're very fortunate to welcome a consummate Kremlin watcher who will shed light on Putin's mindset and motivations and share her thoughts about Russia's fraught relations with the West. It's a great pleasure this morning to introduce our speaker today, Professor Angela Stent. Now, Angela's multiple accomplishments are almost too numerous to mention here, so I'll focus just on the highlights. Angela is director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies and professor of government and foreign service at Georgetown University, and is also a senior non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution and co-chairs its Hewitt Forum on Post-Soviet Affairs. From 2004 to 2006, she served as National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. And prior to that, she served in the Office of Foreign Policy Planning at the US Department of State. She was a member, back in the day, of the Senior Advisory Panel for NATO's Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, and is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She has served on the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council for Russia and Central Asia, and was formerly a trustee of the Eurasia Foundation. And by the way, she has degrees from Cambridge University, the London School of Economics, and got her MA and PhD from Harvard. And finally, she's the author of close to a half dozen books on Russia's relations with the West, the most recent being Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest, which was published last year. I can assure you it is a very comprehensive review of the subject, which is very well worth reading. So Angela, thank you so much for joining us today, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to speak to this group. I did it a few years ago, and I remember then there was a problem with communications with the internet. So let's hope everything works well this morning. So thank you again. What I thought I would do today is spend some time talking about my book. I did just publish an updated version of it with a new epilogue. And then I thought I would then segue into talking about what US-Russian relations might look like in a Biden administration, since clearly that's on many people's minds who look at this subject. So first of all, let me tell you a little bit about the book. And in the book, I set out to answer 3 questions. And the first one was, why was the West so wrong in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed in thinking that post-Soviet Russia would want to become integrated with the West, would want to develop a democracy, would want to develop a market economy that we recognize? And why were we also wrong in believing that if there was closer economic integration with Russia in the world, that would somehow have a beneficial impact on political relations? After all, Russia became part of the G8. Of course, it was kicked out in 2014, but it was in the G8. It joined the World Trade Organization. It was thinking about becoming a member of the OECD. So we really believe that by integrating Russia in those ways economically, it would have a beneficial impact on our political relations with them. And then the second question, and you've already heard a little bit of an allusion to it, is how is Putin's Russia, with a GDP the size of that of Italy, with a declining population, and it actually is still declining, with crumbling infrastructure, and really being excessively dependent on revenues from oil and gas, which make up about 60% of the budget. How is Putin's Russia, with all these limitations and a small economy, how was it able to return as a global player, going back to areas of the world from which it had withdrawn after the Soviet collapse? And then a second part of that question is, while we know that Russia's relations with the West are quite antagonistic and have been deteriorating, why is it that most of the rest of the world regards Russia as a large authoritarian country with whom they can do business? And they don't view Russia as a malign actor in the way that most of the Western countries do. So how is it that Russia, despite its bad relations with the West, gets on pretty well with the rest? And the rest is rather large, including obviously the populations of China and India, just to start off with. And then the third question, which is the most difficult one, is there a better way forward? Would it be possible to have a more productive or a less antagonistic relationship with Russia? So let's turn to the first question. Why were we wrong when the Soviet Union collapsed? And a short answer to this is, I think we believe that during the Cold War, the main problem of dealing with the Soviet Union was because they were at least nominally communists. Well, it turns out that probably the real reason why it was difficult to deal with the Soviet Union was because they were Russians. And by that, I don't mean any kind of character assassination or ethnic stereotyping. I mean that Russians have a very unique view of their place in the world and their own history and civilization, and the things that drive politics. And they're very different from ours. It's just a very different mindset. And again, it goes back hundreds of years, as the worldview of any country does. So Putin himself will always talk about the fact that Russia is a unique civilization, that it is different from and in many ways superior to that of the West. He talks about something called the Russian idea. And part of that Russian idea has historically been to view the West really as an antagonist. And I quote the 19th century poet Fyodor Tchutchev, who said, "There can be no alliance between Russia and the West, either for the sake of interests or for the sake of principles." And what he advocated was that Russia should take advantage of the divisions within the West, which might sound familiar to you today. Putin has said on many occasions he believes that the United States and its allies would like to break up Russia, that we want to diminish Russia. And again, he has said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a great geopolitical catastrophe. We view that somewhat differently of the 20th century. I don't think most people in the West would say that a great political catastrophe in the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. There are other ones, clearly, if you go back to World War II, but he's definitely said that. And he has vowed to make Russia a great power again. He said that explicitly, to restore a strong state. These are all, again, part of the narrative of Russian history. And it means that the tendency among Russian leaders has been to view the West as an antagonist. The exceptions were really under Gorbachev and Yeltsin, if we think of at least the 20th century. And another very important reason, I think, why we were wrong about what we thought might happen with Russia and its relations, at least with the West, is we really didn't focus enough on the traditional Russian view of its place on the Eurasian continent. Geography does matter. If you look at Russia, it's the largest country in the world, but really the only natural border it has is in the north. Otherwise, it has historically been invaded. It has also invaded other countries. And the great 18th century Russian empress, of course, she was really German, Catherine the Great, said, "That which stops growing begins to rot." And she said, "I have to expand my borders in order to keep my population safe." And there really is no historical precedent in Russian history over the past few hundred years for accepting the loss of territory. Russia has shrunk, and then it has expanded again. So this concept of defensive expansionism is very much written into, if you like, the historical DNA, at least, of the Russians. Russia today regards its defense perimeter not as the borders of the Russian Federation, but as the borders of the post-Soviet space. And again, you see that playing out in the conflict in Ukraine, in conflicts in other parts of the post-Soviet space that we see right now. We've had a war between Armenia and Azerbaijan that ended. We've seen all the difficulties in Belarus. So this concept that Russia's security perimeter are really the borders of the post-Soviet space is again very deeply ingrained into the way that Russia views the world. And the Russian historical narrative has also always been, we have been victims of invasions. Russia's neighbors would put it differently, and they would say we've been victims of Russia's expansionism. But certainly that historical tension is there. Now, on the question of why Russia was able to play weak hand so effectively, and don't forget, Putin has been in power for 20 years now. He's seen all these leaders come and go, and he's still there. And he could remain in power until 2036 because they've just changed the Russian constitution a couple of months ago, allowing him to do that. So I would say there are two reasons why Russia has been able to play a weak hand so effectively. And the first one is that Putin had a plan. When he came into office in the year 2000, he explicitly said he wanted to restore a strong state. He regards, and the official narrative is that the 1990s was a time of chaos in Russia, of impoverishment, of too much pluralism and decentralization, and they needed to restore a strong state. And then he committed himself to restoring Russia to its rightful place in the world as a great power. The idea that Russia is not a great power in the world was just unacceptable to him and to many of the people around him. But the second reason why he's been able to play this hand so effectively is that he has been very adept at taking advantages of the mistakes made by the West, of the West distraction, and sort of moving in whenever he can. Putin, I do not regard as a great strategist, but he's certainly a very effective tactician. And he, in a sense, was trained for this. We know that, of course, he started out his professional life as a KGB case officer. So he certainly was trained in how to understand people's weaknesses and their foibles. But the second thing that you have to know about Putin that's very important is that he is a judo champion. We tend to think of chess as the great Russian sport, if you like, and I've just finished watching The Queen's Gambit, and that all comes out there. But for Putin, judo was the way that he managed to get himself out of a rather unpromising hardscrabble childhood. In my book, I have a picture of an article from the 1976 Leningrad Evening News, as it then was, with a picture of a young Vladimir Putin saying, "This is the new judo champion, and he's going far." Now, they didn't know in 1976 how far he would go. But the point is, and he's written about this, there are several books about judo that bear his name on them. I don't know whether he wrote them, but he's certainly listed as an author. And he has understood through that, again, how a weaker player, if you like, can take advantage of a stronger opponent by understanding the stronger opponent's own distraction and weaknesses. So he's been very effective at doing that. And he is, in fact, constantly surprising the world when Russia moves in somewhere, and we haven't really predicted that it would happen. So in my book, I describe two of Putin's major foreign policy successes. I will briefly talk about them. And the first is building a strong strategic partnership with China. It's something we hear about a lot in this country today. Russia and China are the two main antagonists. Maybe we should try and sort of wean Russia off its dependence on China. But this has something that's been essential in enabling Putin to do what he's done. And particularly after 2014, after the annexation of Crimea and the launch of a war in southeastern Ukraine, the Chinese stepped in. They signed a major gas deal with Russia. The Russians had been unwilling to sign it before because the Chinese weren't willing to pay the price that the Russians wanted. But in March of 2014, the Russians didn't have too much choice. And so the Chinese stepped in. They have backed Russia up since 2014. They've never criticized anything it's done in Ukraine. And they enabled Russia to avoid the isolation that the West tried to impose on Russia. US, Europe said, we're going to isolate Russia with sanctions and other things. Well, it hasn't worked because China has been there backing Russia up. Both the Russians and Chinese have shared senses of grievance against the West, against the United States for constructing a post-Cold War world order which didn't take their interests into account. They had to accept an agenda that was essentially set by the West. They both talk about the need for a post-West global order. I think they mean different things by that, but they certainly committed to that. They are both authoritarian leaders. They back each other up. Whatever happens domestically, Russia would never criticize China, for instance, for its treatment of the Uyghurs. The Chinese would never criticize the Russians for jailing or poisoning journalists. So again, they have this sort of authoritarian axis here. And for Russia, this is an existential question. So when people talk about, oh, maybe we can persuade the Russians that it would be more in their interest to join with the West against China, it's an existential issue for Putin because he believes that the West is out to get him or would like regime change in Russia. And he knows that the Chinese are never going to question what he does domestically. So for all these reasons, he has opted, given the choice of being a junior partner to the United States or to China, he has certainly opted for being a junior partner to China. And this is a relationship that's getting stronger. It's not an alliance. And I don't think that's going to happen in the near future, although maybe it could further on. There's certainly much more military cooperation between Russia and China now, and in many other fields. Now, in the longer run, one can question how long this will last. In their common neighborhood, Central Asia, the Chinese are certainly the predominant economic power. And as the Belt and Road project continues, I think they will become more of a security provider. But at the moment, nobody talks about that. And then you have the Russian Far East, which is rapidly being depopulated. You have on one side of the border 6 million Russians. On the other side, you have 120 million Chinese. And the Chinese side of the border is modern, it's bustling, it's building up its economy. On the Russian side of the border, you have still a declining economy. And these territories were part of China. They were taken over by the Tsars in the middle of the 19th century. But if you go and read the Chinese literature, they haven't forgotten that those territories used to be part of China. So this is something nobody talks about publicly, but in the longer run, one can question it. So that's the relationship with China. And then the other area where I would say Putin has been quite successful is Russia's return to the Middle East as a major player. Now, after the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia withdrew largely from the Middle East. It didn't have the wherewithal to be there. And then in 2015, Russia stepped in suddenly to back up its client, Bashar al-Assad, in the Syrian civil war, because it looked as if he was going to be defeated. The second largest number of foreign fighters who were at that point fighting for the Islamic State in Syria were in fact from Russia, either Russian citizens or Central Asians, migrant workers who were working there. So there was a domestic component to this. They didn't want these people to come home. They wanted to defeat the Islamic State there, but they essentially wanted to support Assad. And so Putin has used that, Russia has used that to broaden its footprint in the Middle East. Unlike the Soviet period, when client states were more or less chosen on the basis of ideology, or they preferred left-leaning states in the Middle East, this is a completely pragmatic policy now toward the Middle East. Russia's the only great power who talks to all sides on all issues in the Middle East, to Iran, obviously to Shia groups, to all of the Sunni states, and a more surprising development in the last few years to Israel. So Russia's two new partners in the Middle East are Saudi Arabia and Israel, which are, of course, both allies of the United States. Both of them think that Russia can temper Iranian ambitions in the Middle East. I'm not sure that that's really correct, but Sometimes Russia can. And for the Saudis, the relationship with Russia has a lot to do with oil production. And Russia now has this arrangement with OPEC where they try and limit how much they produce in order to keep the price up. In March, however, there was a brief oil war between Russia and Saudi Arabia. This is the height of the beginning of the COVID crisis when oil prices were basically negative. This is an instance actually where President Trump intervened and managed to get them to stop the oil war. But in general, that's a very important component of the relationship. But the Saudi-Russian relationship is much more than that. The Saudis are buying arms from the Russians. They're talking about strategic partnership. And of course, again, Russia has never criticized Saudi Arabia for anything that happens domestically, including the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. And the relationship with Israel is built on a number of pillars. One of them is that 1.3 million citizens in Israel hail from the former Soviet Union. Russia has been very important in the Syrian civil war, and it has in fact sometimes managed to prevail on Hezbollah, on Iran, to stop some of its activities. And so this is, again, a relationship that has become much closer in the past few years. Okay, how am I doing? I'll just say a word or two about Europe, and then I will get to the US-Russian relationship. So the relationship with Europe under Putin has, in fact, quite severely deteriorated since the annexation of Crimea and the launch of a war in southeastern Ukraine. Russia's most important partner in Europe has always been, for a very long time at least, Germany. The Germans still feel a historical responsibility toward Russia for what happened in World War II, and a gratitude towards Russia for allowing German unification to proceed, quite smoothly, or as smoothly as it could have. And Angela Merkel herself, she's I would say, the world leader who understands Putin best. She grew up in East Germany. She is very aware of what it means to live in a police state. She speaks very good Russian. She won all these competitions for Russian language and culture when she was a teenager. She and Putin don't need interpreters when they talk to each other, but she has also been very, very dismayed by what's happened since 2014, because the annexation of Crimea really shattered the kind of post-Cold War agreement to observe and the borders of the post-Soviet space, even if one could question how they were made under Stalin way back in the 1920s and 30s. And so the Russian-German relationship has really deteriorated. And of course now Alexei Navalny, the main Russian opposition leader, was poisoned in Russia. He's now in Germany. He's being taken care of there. He's recovering. And the Germans have said that they have proof that he was poisoned with this agent, Novichok chemical agent, that was also used in Great Britain to poison the former GRU agent, Sergei Skripal, and his daughter. And there's only one place that comes from, and that's Russia. The Russians have hit back and said that Germany poisoned Navalny. So at this moment, the relationship is particularly bad. And last week, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, actually received a delegation from the AfD, which is the extreme right-wing opposition party in Germany. This is kind of unprecedented because normally he would not receive opposition parties. I think, and people believe it's maybe sort of payback for what's happening with Navalny. But in general, the relationship between Russia and most European Union countries has deteriorated. There's some countries like Hungary and Slovakia and Bulgaria that have a more benign view of Russia, but this is also deteriorated. So let me now just turn to US-Russian relations and what the US-Russian relationship might look like in a Biden administration. And I think there are two important points to remember. One of them is that in general, if you look at post-Cold War US-Russian relations, there's been much more continuity between Democratic and Republican administrations because the issues don't change. The administration may change, but the issues that we're dealing with Russia don't change. I think the other thing that we should sort of remember is that US-Russian relations under President Trump were really sort of an aberration, in as much as you had a US president who praised Putin all the time. Putin praised President Trump as well. It was mutual. Putin blamed the rest of the American system for the bad US-Russian relationship. And it really was unprecedented. Now, in general, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, every US administration has come into office saying it wants a reset with Russia. And in fact, in 2009, when the Obama administration announced its reset, it was then Vice President Biden who was at the Munich Security Conference and said, we're going to reset relations with Russia. I think that pattern has probably ended now for the time being, because I do not see a Biden administration having any illusions about resetting relations with Russia, because all of these resets, be they under President Clinton, President George W. Bush, or President Obama, have all ended in disappointment, again, because the US and Russia have such different ideas about what a productive relationship would look like. So the legacy that we have from the Trump administration in terms of relations with Russia is that we've had a huge gulf between what the president himself said he wanted, President Trump, and what the rest of the executive branch did, and the US Congress too. So President Trump wanted, to make a deal with Russia, why can't we get along with Russia? But in fact, the knowledge of what happened in 2016, of Russian interference in the US election then, has made Russia such a toxic subject in the last 4 years that it really was impossible for President Trump to pursue any of this agenda. So what the actual policy was, is that you had rafts of sanctions imposed by the US Congress. They took the ability to do that away from the president. Under President Obama, for instance, sanctions were imposed by executive order, and he had the ability to lift them or increase them. Now, President Trump doesn't have that, because it's all enshrined in congressional legislation. So you had sanctions, you had diplomatic expulsions, you had the closing down of Russian consulates in Seattle, in San Francisco, and the closing down of these so-called recreational facilities outside Washington and New York, because apparently they were being used for more than recreational purposes. We also had our consulates closed down in St. Petersburg, in Ekaterinburg. So there was tit for tat on that. And then sanctions, rafts of sanctions passed by the Congress. And if the National Defense Authorization Act gets through in the next week and President Trump is not able to veto it, then there'll be even more sanctions. But that was it. There was really nothing else was accomplished. And what you did have was an atrophy of the kind of normal channels of communication between the US and Russia, say from the State Department, that existed in previous administrations. As you probably know, the State Department has been, if you like, deprofessionalized in the last 4 years. And a lot of these normal diplomatic activities haven't taken place, including things like a strategic stability dialogue with Russia, which I think there was maybe one meeting in the whole of the last 4 years. And then the other thing that didn't happen in the Trump administration was sort of the pillar of the US-Russian relationship, however bad it is the fact that we are the world's 2 nuclear superpowers. Between us, we have 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. And traditionally, and ever since President Nixon went to the Soviet Union in 1972, at the height of the Vietnam War, and signed what was then called the SALT Agreement with Brezhnev, that is an agreement limiting the number of strategic nuclear weapons that the United States and Russia had. Ever since then, for the last 50 years, we've had this regime of different arms control agreements that regulate these nuclear weapons. Well, the Trump administration pulled out of one nuclear agreement, the agreement on intermediate range nuclear weapons, because we said the Russians were cheating. The Russians pulled out of it too, so that's gone. The Trump administration pulled out of the Open Skies Treaty, which has enabled us to have an insight into sort of what the Russians are doing, but has also given them insight into what we were doing. And it failed to renew or extend the New START agreement. The New START agreement on strategic nuclear weapons expires next February the 5th. The Trump administration belatedly entered into negotiations on it, but they insisted that the Chinese nuclear weapons had to be counted in any new agreement. And the Chinese said in many different ways, we are not interested in talking to you about our nuclear weapons. So that was a non-starter. And so that, I think, has gone completely by the wayside. So, the other final thing to say is it does appear that in this presidential election cycle, there really wasn't significant Russian election interference. That's what our government officials have told us. I think there'll be a report coming out probably in January, which will give us more detail. But we can speculate why that was. It may have been because of things we did, or it may have been because Putin may have believed that the election interference in 2016 was so counterproductive to having anything happen in the US-Russian relationship that maybe it wasn't worth it. Now, as I say this, you may know that President Putin is the one remaining world leader who has not acknowledged that President-elect Joe Biden will be the president. And when asked about this, I had a chance a couple of weeks ago to be on a panel interviewing the Russian ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Antonov. He said, we're going to wait until all the legal procedures have ended. This was a couple of weeks ago. So I said, well, how about December the 14th, today, when presumably the Electoral College will validate the results of the presidential election. And at that point, he was non-committal. So we'll wait and see, but it's curious why that hasn't happened. And again, we can debate that. So what would I expect from a Biden administration? I think what we do know is that they are committed to making sure that we do have an arms control agreement, the one remaining one with the Russian Federation. There will be a scant 2 weeks between the inauguration and when the New START treaty expires. And I think they will do everything they can to just extend it with no changes. So that means that the Senate doesn't have to ratify it. It would be much more problematic, obviously, if the Senate had to. But they can extend it for 5 years. And then at some point, there will be negotiations on a follow-on agreement, which might include other countries, it will include other systems, but the main thing will be to get that the existing agreement extended. Beyond that, I think there will be a review of all of these sanctions. I don't necessarily think that they'll be lifted or modified. I think the people whom President-elect Biden has appointed now to be his chief foreign policy people, particularly Antony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, I think that they all understand that sanctions is one of the few ways that the United States has of responding to things that the Russians do that we consider to be against our interests. But I think they may also review some of them and see whether it's worth it. For instance, we now have another round of sanctions that will probably be imposed on our German allies, which have to do with the construction of a natural gas pipeline from Russia to Germany called Nord Stream 2. So since one of the things that the Biden team is committed to is to reinvigorating relations with our allies, and particularly the relationship with Germany, which was very damaged under President Trump, they might have to think about how to finesse this. And I think another important point to make is, in general, I think you're going to see the reprofessionalization of the State Department and a restoration of these traditional channels of dealing with Russia. And I think, for instance, strategic stability talks, they are committed to reviving them and making sure that they go on. Now, beyond that, it's more difficult. Certainly, the Biden administration is committed to the pursuit of democracy, of human rights, and to pushing back against global kleptocracy. They've made that clear. That is all going to be quite problematic with Russia. That's not something clearly that the Russians welcome, nor will they welcome a reinvigoration of the NATO alliance, which I think is on the cards too. There may also be issues that have to do with cyber interference. The Russians, of course, have proposed that the US and Russia sit down and talk about a general cyber agreement. The US has been very skeptical about that, not trusting that the Russians would abide by any agreement, but we might see that going forward. In terms of other areas of possible cooperation, returning to the Paris agreements and accepting that climate change is a major issue, which is what the Biden administration will surely do with a new climate envoy, John Kerry. Previously Putin said things like, oh, it's not bad if it gets 2 degrees warmer in Russia. Interestingly enough, a few weeks ago in a major speech, he talked about the dangers of global climate change and the need to work on it. So it's possible that climate change is an area where the US and Russia could work together. And one aspect of that would be what's happening in the Arctic with climate change and many of the challenges there. And another possible area of cooperation is if the United States returns to the World Health Organization and is willing to work with other countries in terms of the pandemic and dealing with global public health crisis, that could be another area where the US and Russia could work together. But I think one should be quite realistic about the fact that at best, this would be a normalization, if you like, of the relations. This is a relationship where at the best of times, cooperation and competition coexist. Clearly, the competition is very much on people's minds now. And if you remember what President-elect Biden said during the campaign and during the presidential debates, he identified Russia as the major enemy of the United States. And I think the final point I'll just make is the Biden people are committed to trying to reach out to civil society in Russia. And I think when you think about how can one improve ties with Russia, or at least have a more productive relationship, part of it is obviously finding areas where we have mutual interests and where we can work together. And arms control, I guess, is the main one there. And then I think from the American point of view, it's also, remembering that the Kremlin doesn't speak for the Russian people. I've just come off a webinar this morning with experts in Russia and their best polling organization saying that probably a third of Russians don't support the current regime. So just remembering that Russian society exists and trying to maintain those links to reach out to civil society, to have exchanges is very important, even though, again, one has to be realistic about how much can be accomplished. So I think my time is up there. I welcome your questions and comments.
Well, Angela, thank you so much for a very broad, sweeping, and comprehensive review of Putin's world. Much appreciated and very, very interesting. Let me ask the first question, if I may. Give us your thoughts on, we hear so much about endemic corruption within the Putin regime, the fact that he's beholden to the oligarchs and they in turn are beholden to him. How does that all work? And is this a sustainable way to run a government?
Well, so the first thing you have to remember is if you're trying to understand how the system works in Russia, it's very difficult because it's mainly now run by people who were formerly in the intelligence services, and they know how to make sure that you don't get information. From what we understand, first of all, formal institutions in Russia don't really count very much. It's all informal ties and informal networks. It's a system where Putin is the single most powerful person in the system, but he's not all powerful. So he depends on these different groups of oligarchs, many of whom come from the intelligence services. They depend on him for the assets that they own. And here I will quote a Russian colleague of mine who says that Russia is run by the people who own it. So these are people who've amassed fabulous amounts of wealth. I can't tell you what there are. I'm sure you've seen, estimates of how rich President Putin is, how rich these other people are. We know from the Panama Papers, we had a small insight into that when it turned out that a cellist who is a childhood friend of President Putin's, a cellist had a bank account in Panama of $2 billion, which is pretty good money for a cellist to earn. So we know that there are significant sums of money deployed around the world by different entities and which one believes can be traced back certainly to the Kremlin. So these people depend on President Putin to keep their assets. And that's why initially after the annexation of Crimea, when sanctions were imposed on Putin's inner circle, as they were considered to be by the US and by the Europeans, it was mistaken to think that these people would get together and say, oh, I can't visit my bank accounts and my homes in London or Paris or New York or Miami. Therefore, let's get together and get rid of this guy so that we have someone in power that doesn't take actions that make then the West impose sanctions on us. That's not how it works. And in fact, a lot of those sanctions made these people more dependent on President Putin because they were barred from traveling to the West. But on the other hand, he also depends on them, for maintaining his position in power, and therefore there's this mutual dependence. So again, we get insights into corruption. Interestingly enough, in the last few weeks, an expose was done by Russian media. They happened to get the hacked emails of the former son-in-law of President Putin, who's married to his younger daughter. And it was just very interesting to see all of the assets that this person had, all of the things that he owned, the villas, et cetera, et cetera. He's now divorced from Putin's daughter, and I'm not sure that he owns all of those. But so, and then of course, Alexei Navalny, when he was in Russia and able to have his YouTube channel, he of course has exposed significant amounts of corruption, showing how a number of these top leaders, all of the villas they own, and all kind, the properties they own, et cetera, et cetera. So we know there is a large amount of high-level corruption there, and we know we understand that the system, functions because of the kind of this mutual protection. But beyond that, there are many details that we don't know.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I have a question from the audience. What, in your view, are Putin's top 3 strengths and 3 most obvious weaknesses?
Well, I think, a top strength is that he's managed to create this system where even if we can't believe, official poll numbers about how popular he is, there are enough people who still support him, or they support him, and maybe this is part of his success, that there's really no alternative. So he's managed to create a system where he has eliminated any potential rivals, not necessarily physically, but just made sure politically that they can't really challenge him, and where people believe there's no alternative. And so he's maneuvered the system so that now this year, they had all these constitutional changes which enable him to stay in power if he wants to until 2036, and sort of squelches any talk of succession. So he certainly managed to do that. I think he's also managed in his foreign policy to create a system where most countries in the West don't want to do anything that will further provoke Russia. The situation is that, yes, we'll impose sanctions on him, but no European country, and not the United States either, is going to respond to things that he does in his neighborhood militarily. Obama was quite clear about that when all of the crisis in Ukraine broke out in 2014. So it's a system where he can get away with a lot of things because he knows that, yes, sanctions will follow. And I think the Russians, the elite understand that that's going to happen, and they probably won't be lifted, but where really nobody's going to push back on those kinds of issues. And that mainly what happens is that, Crimea is annexed, there's a war in southeastern Ukraine, and gradually countries just, as time goes on, countries accept this. There are still sanctions on Russia, both from the Europeans and the US, but I think that's another thing that he's managed to do. Now, weaknesses, he hasn't really undertaken any significant economic reform. The weakness of the Russian economy is that it's highly dependent on these hydrocarbon revenues. And when oil prices are very low, that causes, major problems. The COVID crisis has hit Russia very hard. Obviously, it's hit most countries very hard. But what you have in Russia, for instance, this year is a public health system that was already weak. Apart from the major cities in Russia, the provincial healthcare system is really pretty bad. 30% of provincial healthcare facilities do not have running hot water. About the same amount don't have access to central heating. And the COVID crisis in Russia, I think, has really exposed the weaknesses of that, so much so that many Russians have no faith in their own health system. And I mean, we have enough people in this country who say they wouldn't take a vaccine, even though we have the Pfizer vaccine now. But in Russia, large numbers of Russians are very skeptical about the vaccine and whether it's safe, just because they have very little confidence in the public health system. So I think that, and then plus the fact that you have that the economy itself has done so badly. These, I mean, I think the lasting weakness of Putin's legacy will be, unless there is real modernization of the economy and diversification. If Russia is this dependent on oil and gas revenues in 20 or 30 years' time, when presumably the world is moving further and further away from dependence on hydrocarbons and people are driving electric cars, what's the future for Russia then? I think that's a real question mark.
Okay, I'm going to paraphrase this question. In terms of longer term objectives, this audience person is asking, I'm sure, as kind of a to-do list or must do, what does Putin really think he might be able to accomplish, let's just say, in the next 5 or 10 years?
So he has nominally something called the national projects, which is something that's been in existence for a number of years. It's a 400 billion program to revive and improve science, technology, infrastructure, the public health system, all of these things that where you really need to invest and improve the economic and social system. So I think that that's what he would say is his vision to strengthen this. Whether it's going to happen is dubious, because there have been projects like this before and then they never really get implemented. So I think that would be one thing that he would want as his legacy. Russia is a great power, respected by the world. He'd like Russia to be treated as if it were the Soviet Union. He's not trying to restore the Soviet Union, but he would certainly like it to be treated as if it was such. And Russia as a member of the global board of directors. And I think what he would want is for the rest of the world to accept that Russia's interests, that what it considers its legitimate interests, are accepted as legitimate by the outside world. I think these are all things that he's striving for, and to prolong the system as long as he can. I mean, things have gotten more repressive in Russia over the last few years. There's now just a new foreign agents law passed where if you really have any contact with foreigners, somebody can label you as a foreign agent and then you can be subject to different fines. And then I think another of Putin's projects is to get the world to accept a historical narrative about what happened in World War II, which is not the conventional understanding of what happened in World War II. It's really elevating very much the role of the Soviet Union, which obviously was very important in defeating Hitler, downplaying the role of the United States and the British, and then in essence, denying that at the outbreak of World War II, when you had the Nazi-Soviet pact, 2 weeks after the Nazis invaded Poland, the Soviets invaded Eastern Poland and took over and occupied that part of the country. So all of those things, and then making it in this new constitution a crime to question the official narrative of World War II. This has been part of his sort of pet project, and what he wants as his legacy is this. It's a very unique version of the Soviet role in World War II that really downplays everyone else's contribution to it.
Okay, let me interject one of my questions, if I could. The situation in Belarus, what are Putin's options, particularly if the demonstrators actually do, successfully take over the parliament or something of that nature, if things become really very dangerous for Lukashenko and somehow he's got to be propped up?
So, I mean, this has been a very difficult situation for the Russians, particularly since, of course, they're going to have parliamentary elections next September. And Putin's greatest fear would be that they have a similar thing playing out in Russia, in less than a year's time, where you have people not accepting the results of the election. So, Russia and Belarus do have on paper an alliance. They're part of a union state. Lukashenko has been dependent on Russia economically, politically. The Russians have military forces in Belarus. And for them, for Putin, Belarus really is, if you talk about defensive perimeter, it's the westernmost outpost of this defense perimeter. On the other hand, Putin didn't necessarily like Lukashenko that much. But when these demonstrations broke out, Lukashenko had once again been flirting to have better relations with the European Union, with the United States. We were about to send an ambassador there for the first time in many, many years. But then he realized once this happened and the demonstrations came out in the street, it reinforced his understanding about how dependent he was on Russia. So in the beginning, Putin promised that there was a special police force that could be dispatched to Belarus to deal with the demonstrators. In the end, they didn't do it because, ironically, the people in Belarus have not been anti-Russian. They were very critical of Lukashenko and the corruption there, but they weren't anti-Russian. And I think in one level, Putin realized that if you send Russian troops to deal with this is going to turn the population against Russia. What the Russians did in the beginning was they thought that the media coverage in Belarus was really not very professional and not very good. So they've sent their top media people from RT, the state-run TV channel that broadcasts to the outside world, and other media. And so essentially the official Belarusian media have been taken over by Russian journalists, and they're really deciding what the coverage is. Russia has provided a not very significant, but at least enough of a loan to Lukashenko to keep things going in the Belarusian economy. If you look at the video footage on YouTube of Lukashenko's visit to Russia a couple of months ago, the body language is telling Putin is looking rather bored, and Lukashenko is kind of leaning forward, saying all of these praiseworthy things about Putin. So where we are now is you have continuing demonstrations. What the Russians are trying to persuade Lukashenko to do is to accept constitutional reform. So that would mean redoing the constitution and maybe giving more powers to the parliament, but it would also involve, in the end, a transition of power, having someone else but Lukashenko be in power. And he has sort of admitted that that will happen. The question is, who would that person be? And up till now, it's not clear who someone would be who would be acceptable to the Russians as well to take over. Clearly, what the Russians do not want is a successful color revolution, i.e. a revolution where people are out in the streets and where the security forces desert Lukashenko and then they join the people. That hasn't happened yet. And so I think what the Russians are looking at is making sure that that doesn't happen. So I think the Russian scenario is to have a transition of power, a different leader, but one that's acceptable to the Russians. But would that person be acceptable to the rest of the Belarusian population? Again, they've been coming out since August the 9th in the streets. The repression has gotten worse. That people have been tortured, jailed. A significant number are now living in exile, including Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who's the who said that she, in fact, won the election. So this stalemate can continue, but I think the pressure from the Russians is now going to be a leadership transition with a new constitution.
Yeah, that's very interesting. To follow on the theme of what you had pointed out, that Russia has failed, or Putin has pretty much failed to successfully diversify his economy beyond oil and gas. One questioner asks, what do we actually trade with Russia now? Do they make anything we need and want?
This is a great question. When I'm lecturing to students on this subject, I always start off and say, look around in your house and see how many things you have that are made in China. Now look around and see how many things are made in Russia. So Russia exports basically two commodities. Oil and gas, hydrocarbons, and weapons. Neither of these are something that the United States needs. We certainly don't need their energy. We're self-sufficient in energy by now, and we don't buy their weapons because we produce superior weapons. So our economic relationship with Russia is really minimal. And that's one of the reasons why our general relationship with Russia is very skewed. It's overly focused on nuclear weapons, on these strategic things, because we don't have that many stakeholders in the relationship with Russia. Now, if you look at the US-China relationship, again, I mean, the relationship now clearly is very bad, but we have a significant number of Americans who are involved in business with China and who are stakeholders because that relationship is so important. But we have very few stakeholders. I mean, when Trump and Putin met in 2018 in Helsinki, we focused very much on the fact that Trump said that he believed Putin's denials that Russia interfered in 2016. But one of the other things that came out of that meeting was a commitment to establish a high-level business dialogue to promote US-Russian relations. Well, that hasn't happened. One of the reasons, of course, is because of the sanctions. You know, what are you going to have a business dialogue about? You know, the previous ambassador, Ambassador John Huntsman, really tried to promote that, but it was difficult. But then there are other reasons. For instance, until very recently, the Russians had jailed or then under house arrest Michael Calvi, a US businessman who's been in Russia for a long time, is a big promoter of US-Russian economic relations. But his Russian partner, one of the Russian partners, or they did a deal with a Russian bank, and they decided that they actually wanted to take over most of his company. And so they instigated criminal procedures against him. Normally, a business dispute like that is a civil dispute. But this was criminal procedures. He was jailed. He was under house arrest. He's now released from house arrest, but he still has to stay there. And the US business community said, if things like this continue to happen, where US business people can't guarantee that their property rights and things like that will be respected, how can we do that much more business with Russia? So that business dialogue didn't emerge. Maybe it can in the future, but I think there'd have to be much more confidence, that the Russian legal system, will respect the rights of foreign business people in Russia.
Yeah. And staying on the issue of oil and gas, hydrocarbons, what are the chances the Nord Stream pipeline Part 2 actually might be rejected by the Germans? I gather that Angela Merkel is having a tough time trying to figure this one out.
So she has explicitly said that this pipeline should go ahead. So with a little bit of context, the Germans have been importing gas from the Soviet Union and Russia since 1970. So the first gas pipeline was constructed then. And the Russians have been reliable suppliers. You've had two previous attempts in US history to prevent the construction of oil or gas pipelines from the Soviet Union / Russia to the West. So in 1963, the Kennedy administration tried to prevent the construction of an oil pipeline from the Soviet Union actually to Eastern Europe by sanctioning pipeline components that were made in Germany and other countries. In 1983, the Reagan administration tried to prevent the construction of the Yamal gas pipeline from the Soviet Union to Europe by sanctioning German and British and other components that were going into the construction of the pipeline. Margaret Thatcher, of course, who was a great friend of President Reagan's, not only resisted this, she went up to Scotland and essentially stood at the shipyards of a company that was exporting components of the Soviet Union and said, we support you. So now we're in the third version of this. And the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is nearly complete. There's just a small portion of it that needs to be completed. And last year, a year ago, the US sanctioned anybody who was involved in, and these are Western companies now, in the completion of the pipeline. And so the Western companies complied with this. It was particularly a Swiss company, because obviously they don't want to lose business with the United States. So the Russians have been trying to complete the pipeline for the last year. They don't quite have all of the equipment that you need, apparently, to complete it. So we're now in a situation where they stopped construction on the pipeline, but it's just resumed last week. And then you have these sanctions that will probably be passed in the National Defense Authorization Act, that they're going to sanction any Western company that insures any of these components. In other words, really quite draconian. My gut feeling is that this pipeline will be completed because it is nearly complete. If it's not completed, I think the Russians will renege on a deal they made with the Ukrainians because, of course, this pipeline bypasses Ukraine. And so Ukraine has been losing revenues from the transport of Russian gas through Ukraine. The Russians did sign a deal with the Ukrainians last year, which was part of a deal that the Germans worked out with the Russians that had to do with Nord Stream. The Russians may renege on that. So in the end, the Ukrainians may come out worse from this, but probably it is going to be completed because Merkel herself has said that she supports its completion.
Okay, here's a question from the audience, a very specific hypothetical question regarding the growth of the oligarchs. How would the situation possibly have been different had Yeltsin tapped someone like Nemtsov rather than Putin to succeed him?
Yeah, that is a hypothetical question. I mean, what happened in terms of the oligarchs? So the whole oligarchic system, built up under Yeltsin, right? It really stems from the privatization schemes they had in the 1990s, which enabled a small group of people to become incredibly rich very quickly. And so you had the oligarchs, and at that point, they owned most of the media. You had competition between them, but they were essential. They were essential actually to enabling Yeltsin to be reelected in 1996. Now, the reason he handed over the reins of power, if you like, to Putin was, yes, I mean, someone like Boris Nemtsov was certainly someone who was close to the Yeltsin family. He had been in power, but Yeltsin was increasingly being, pressurized and opposed by people who didn't like this system. And as he became increasingly infirm in the year 1999, he tried out, various successes. And the reason he chose Putin was he was promised that Putin would, have a deal with the Yeltsin family, that nothing would happen to them, that Putin was loyal, and that Putin would keep his word. So he hands over power to him. And Putin did keep his word in as much as nobody in the Yeltsin family was prosecuted. But what Putin then, of course, subsequently did was to go after the rest of the Yeltsin oligarchs, including Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the owner of the Yukos oil company, who landed up doing 10 years in prison and in a labor camp. And then Putin brought in his own oligarchs. So if someone like Nemtsov had been, become president of the Russian Federation, one assumes that the Yeltsin oligarchs would have remained where they were, but that would have meant that you had a very contentious media space, and it would have, everything could have turned out differently, obviously, if you had a leader who was more committed to a more pluralistic system and to better relations with the West. But you certainly would have had oligarchs. They would just have been different ones.
Another question from the audience. Could you, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, could you talk about the impact of the Magnitsky Act, and as well, while you're on that issue, our economic sanctions against Russia? Are they in any way effective?
So the Magnitsky Act has had an impact, again, in meaning that the people who are sanctioned under the Magnitsky Act, can travel to the West. Now, having said that, a number of people who are sanctioned under the Magnitsky Act are not necessarily, and this is for gross abuses of human rights and things like that, they wouldn't be traveling to the West anyway, because, and they don't necessarily own assets here. But it's served, in some ways, it's supposed to serve as a deterrent. What's happened is that you obviously have people who want to make sure that they don't get on the Magnitsky Act. I think the problem with the Magnitsky Act in the beginning was it only singled out Russia for human rights violations. There's now a global Magnitsky Act, which I think is, more appropriate because it's now singling out people around the world for that. Now, broadly on the impact of sanctions. So we know that the post-Ukraine sanctions have had an impact on the Russian economy. And those sanctions, by the way, involve not only Putin's cronies, but Russia's access to capital markets. And that has had a significant impact on the Russian economy, that plus falling oil prices. So you could say probably the Russian economy, this is before COVID, was contracting by about 2% a year as a result of the sanctions. Now, have the sanctions had any impact on Russian actions and behavior? That's much more difficult to prove. Now, the proponents of sanctions will say, well, Russia might have gone further in Ukraine. They might have taken more territory had there not been sanctions. That's possible. You can't prove or disprove that. But it hasn't made them any more willing to compromise on Ukraine. We've had the Minsk agreements have been there since February of 2015. The Russians haven't really fulfilled any of them. There have been a few prisoner exchanges with Ukraine, but it hasn't, the Russians have not withdrawn their troops to behind the Russian-Ukrainian border, and they insist on a different sequencing of these agreements. So there's really been no movement or very little movement on Ukraine. And this is a conflict where 14,000 people have died, and there are still casualties. This is not a frozen conflict. People are still getting killed. And my hope is, for the last year, the United States has been absent in Ukraine, and that's largely been because of the impeachment of President Trump and its connection to what was happening in Ukraine. I think you'll see a much more active policy in a Biden administration. Whether that will affect what Russia does remains to be seen. But so there's really no impact there. And so I think, and what you have had is that the Russians have imposed their own counter sanctions on Europe. This doesn't affect the United States. But the Russians then said, okay, if you Europeans sanction us, we're going to sanction you. And so we're going to stop buying your agricultural products. And as a result of that, the Russian agricultural sector has done much better. Russia is now exporting grain in a way that hasn't been for decades. And it's also promoted, domestic Russian agriculture, like the cheese in the cheese sector, if you like, because they banned imports of all of these fancy French and Italian cheeses. And the Russians, at least the wealthier people, got used to them. So a few years ago, I go to this annual conference called the Valdai International Discussion Club. It's been in existence since 2004. And at the end of the conference, we always meet with President Putin. And a couple of years ago, one of the featured speakers in this conference was the cheese king of Russia, someone who was a patriotic cheese manufacturer, and said, we make Parmesan, we make mascarpone, we make all the cheeses that you used to buy from Europe. So in fact, it has had a positive impact on the Russian agricultural sector, the counter sanctions that Putin imposed, and those counter sanctions are still there. So I think you can argue, the problem with sanctions is if you don't impose sanctions, and if you're not going to respond militarily to what Russia does, because you don't want to provoke a military conflict, how can you respond? How can you deter Russia from annexing a Crimea or destabilizing a country? And sanctions appear to be the only method that we have, but it's not clear that they're that productive, and they certainly shouldn't be imposed on our allies. Then you come back to Nord Stream. Is it worth imposing sanctions that adversely impact on our allies? And I think we need more of a debate about that.
Looking again at military intervention, Syria back in 2015, hasn't that become a little more complicated for Putin than he expected it would? And it does complicate his relations with Turkey, among others. What are your general thoughts on where he stands vis-a-vis the Syria intervention?
Well, the main point of the Syrian intervention was to make sure that Assad stayed in power, and Assad's still in power. So I think
Yeah.
the major accomplishment, that was the major goal. Now, yes, the relationship with Turkey has been complicated by that. You had the shoot down of the Russian aircraft by Turkey, and really the freezing of Russian-Turkish relations. Then Erdogan more or less apologized, and they improved. You've had Turkish casualties now in the area where you have Russia and Turkey patrolling in the Idlib area. And that certainly caused Mr. Erdogan to travel to Ukraine to proclaim that Crimea is part of Ukraine. So there are certainly tensions in the Russian-Turkish relationship. And now we'll have to see what happens with the Russian peacekeepers in Nagorno-Karabakh now, and Turkish military personnel being there to observe the ceasefire, and really suddenly Turkey being a presence in Russia's backyard in a way it hasn't been for a very long time. But in the case of Syria, I mean, Putin has managed a delicate balance of getting both the Turks and the Iranians to meet with the Russians to talk about what happens after the civil war is over. It is complicated, and I think looking forward, I'm not sure once the civil war is over that Russia and Iran have the same interests in a post-conflict Syria. What are the Iranians going to do? What is it they want? Is it necessarily what the Russians want? So that could become more complicated. But you have to remember that the intervention in Syria hasn't been very expensive for Russia. There haven't been that many casualties because it's mainly air power. Russia has now modernized its airbase in Latakia and its port in Tartus. So its military presence in Syria has been strengthened. And as we say, Assad is in power. And from the Russian point of view, he may leave, but they want to say in who succeeds him. And they manage to some extent to deal with their own fundamentalist and terrorism problem by having all these people who've gone to Syria killed in Syria as opposed to coming back to Russia. So I would say at the moment, whereas in the future there may be complications, I would say Putin's accomplished his major goal.
Good. Well, we're getting close to your time limit. I know you'd like to have other important things to do at 11:20. Let me ask the last question very quickly, and you've alluded to it to some extent, but do the US and Russia have any significant shared interests, or are we always going to be rivals on every issue out there? So your brief answer.
Right. I mean, we do have a shared interest, I think, in regulating our nuclear arsenals and in preventing nuclear proliferation. And, so and those two things go together. We probably should have a shared interest in dealing with global climate change issues. Counterterrorism, yes, in theory, we want to counter terrorism, but in fact, counter-terrorist cooperation has been very difficult with the Russians. Occasionally it's worked. So it's something that we can, continue to do. Beyond that, there just aren't, we don't need them economically, and they need us economically more than we need them. But there isn't, a major economic interest there. So beyond that, it's very hard at this point to identify, major interests. I mean, frankly, from the US point of view, one major interest is to ensure that Russia isn't a spoiler and can't work against US interests in countries like Venezuela or in parts of Africa. But that's, if you like, a negative interest, not a positive one.
Well, Angela, we got you at 11:19. How's that for precision?
Thank you.
we want to thank you very, very much for a terrific presentation today. So, and I'm sure our audience shares my opinion on that. So, Mal, do you want to sign us off? Or
I certainly do.
You.
I certainly do. Many thanks to our distinguished guest, Professor Angela Stent, for another terrific presentation for us. We thank you for that. We also want to thank Tyler for his work, Joan Kuhn and her colleagues at the library for their support, for Carrie Krems of the Newcastle Media Arts Center, and all of you who have participated with us today and who have participated with us all semester, if you will, under difficult and challenging circumstances. Hopefully, all of you have received copies of the December newsletter. The main focus of that letter briefly outlines the spring 2021 program, which will run from February 8th through March 10th. Please mark your calendars. The January newsletter will provide more details. If you have friends or family who would like to join us in the spring, please email Joan Kuhn at jkuhn@wlsmail.org so that we may be sure to add you to the newsletter and invitation list. Until we meet again on February 8th, please be safe. Happy and healthy holidays and Happy New Year to all.
And I just want to add also, thank you all, Mal and the entire planning committee, Tyler, Don, and the rest of them. Hope you have a wonderful and happy holiday season. And again, to Angela Stent, thank you again for an unbelievable lecture and question and answer period for the library. We appreciate this. You were terrific. And again,
Same to you,
everybody,
Joan.
have a good time.
Yeah.
Bye.
Same to you, Joan. Thanks.
Okay. Bye, Tyler.